By the early 5th century CE, Roman Britain had not fallen in battle. No decisive invasion shattered its cities, and no conquering army dismantled its institutions. Instead, imperial authority withdrew incrementally, leaving behind a province still inhabited, still cultivated, and still organized, yet no longer governed from Rome. In the late 4th century CE, Britain remained formally part of the Roman Empire, but its position was increasingly peripheral. Imperial priorities had shifted toward defending the Rhine and Danube frontiers, while internal civil wars strained administrative cohesion. Britain, distant from the empire's political core, experienced these pressures primarily through reduced military investment and declining imperial oversight. Records indicate that the province was expected to manage its own defense and taxation to a degree unprecedented since its conquest in the 1st century CE. The Roman military presence in Britain had already been diminishing for decades before the symbolic date of 410 CE. Units were redeployed to continental conflicts, particularly during the reigns of Magnus Maximus in the 380s and Constantine III in the early 400s. Archaeological evidence from forts along Hadrian's Wall and the Saxon shore suggests reduced maintenance rather than violent destruction. Coin circulation declines sharply after the 390s, indicating disruptions to centralized pay systems rather than economic collapse driven by invasion. The traditional narrative of Roman Britain's fall derives largely from later sources, most notably Gildas, writing in the 6th century, and Bede in the 8th. These authors portray the Roman departure as a moral and political catastrophe. However, contemporary Roman records describe a more administrative disengagement. The so-called rescript of Honorius, preserved by Zosimus, states that the cities of Britain were instructed to look to their own defense. This directive implies abandonment by governance rather than defeat by force. Urban life in late Roman Britain did not immediately disappear. Excavations at Wroxeter, Viraconium Cornoviorum, reveal continued occupation into the 5th and possibly 6th centuries. Substantial timber-framed buildings replaced stone structures, suggesting adaptation rather than destruction. Similarly, Caerwent, Ventisolurum, shows evidence of ongoing civic activity, including metalworking and reuse of public spaces. These sites indicate that local elites remained in place, managing resources and labor without imperial oversight. Administrative functions previously handled by Roman officials were gradually assumed by regional authorities. While formal taxation systems collapsed, landholding elites continued to exercise control over agricultural production. Villas were abandoned unevenly. Some declined rapidly, while others persisted in modified forms. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of continued farming, storage, and trade at rural sites, though at a reduced scale. This pattern reflects contraction rather than disappearance of economic life. Material culture from the late 4th and early 5th centuries demonstrates continuity alongside transformation. Roman pottery production declines, but locally made wares increase in relative frequency. Imported goods become scarce, especially after 400 CE, reflecting Britain's removal from Mediterranean trade networks. Yet regional exchange persisted, particularly along river systems and former Roman roads. These routes continued to shape movement and settlement patterns long after imperial administration ceased. Military organization underwent similar changes. Without regular pay or imperial command structures, standing legions could not be sustained. However, archaeological indicators such as weapon deposits and fortified hilltop sites suggest that armed groups remained active. These forces were likely organized locally, drawing on former Roman soldiers and native recruits. The reuse of Iron Age hill forts during this period points to defensive strategies rooted in regional control rather than imperial frontier defense. The political landscape of post-Roman Britain became increasingly fragmented. No single authority replaced Roman governance. Instead, power was distributed among local rulers whose legitimacy derived from land control, kinship networks, and military capability. Written records from this period are sparse, but later genealogies and place name evidence suggest the emergence of small polities across western and southern Britain. These entities were not yet kingdoms in the medieval sense, but they exercised localized authority. Religious institutions remained one of the few sources of continuity across the Roman withdrawal. Christianity, established in Britain by the 4th century, persisted despite the loss of imperial patronage. Church buildings were maintained in some urban centers, and bishops continued to operate within local communities. The survival of ecclesiastical structures provided a degree of ideological stability, even as secular administration fractured. The environment of late Roman Britain was therefore neither uniformly chaotic nor centrally ordered. It was characterized by uneven adaptation to changing political realities. Regions with stronger Romano-British elite presence maintained continuity longer than those more dependent on imperial supply systems. Western Britain, in particular, shows signs of sustained local governance well into the 5th century, while eastern regions became more vulnerable to external pressures. These external pressures intensified as Britain's defenses weakened. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates increasing raids by Picts from the north and Irish groups from the west. At the same time, Germanic mercenaries, later identified as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, were recruited to supplement local defenses. This practice, recorded in later sources, reflects a pragmatic response to manpower shortages rather than an immediate loss of control. The cumulative effect of these developments was not the collapse of society, but the transformation of authority. Roman Britain ceased to function as an imperial province, yet its population, infrastructure, and social hierarchies endured. The absence of centralized administration created a political vacuum, one that would be filled by regional leaders capable of organizing defense and extracting loyalty. It is within this context that later traditions would locate figures of exceptional military leadership. By the early 5th century, Britain had become a post-imperial society shaped by inherited Roman systems, localized power, and persistent insecurity. Central authority had dissolved, but social order remained negotiated through land, force, and tradition. As Roman governance faded, the conditions emerged for new forms of leadership to arise. Leaders remembered not through administrative records, but through narrative transmission in the centuries that followed. As Roman authority dissolved, new threats and local leaders began to define post-imperial Britain. Before continuing, viewers who value long-form, research-driven history are encouraged to subscribe to the channel. Enabling notifications ensures access to future Nightfall history documentaries as they are released. Viewer engagement, through comments and discussion, also helps guide the focus of upcoming episodes. In a land without emperors, governors, or legions, survival depended on those who could organize violence. By the early 5th century CE, Britain existed in a political environment defined by fragmentation. With Roman administrative authority withdrawn, no centralized institution remained capable of coordinating defense across the province. The former mechanisms of imperial control, standing armies, tax collection, and provincial governance, had dissolved, leaving communities responsible for their own protection. This transition did not occur uniformly, but it reshaped Britain's political landscape into a mosaic of localized power centers. Written evidence from this period is limited and retrospective, but it consistently describes insecurity as a defining condition. Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century, portrays Britain as a land beset by external raids and internal weakness following the Roman departure. Although his account is moralistic and shaped by theological concerns, it reflects a broader reality supported by archaeological data. The absence of a coordinated defense system exposed Britain to sustained pressure from multiple directions. From the north, Pictish groups conducted raids across former Roman frontiers. Archaeological indicators along Hadrian's Wall suggest that, while large-scale invasions are not clearly evidenced, frontier defenses were no longer systematically maintained. From the west, Irish raiders, later referred to as Scoti, targeted coastal and riverine settlements. These incursions are corroborated by both later textual references and evidence of fortified coastal sites, particularly in western Britain. The eastern and southeastern regions faced a different form of pressure. Germanic groups from the North Sea coast, identified in later sources as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, initially appear not as mass invaders but as small warbands. Archaeological finds, including weapon burials and distinct material culture, suggest limited settlement during the early 5th century. These groups were likely recruited as mercenaries to supplement local defenses, a practice consistent with late Roman military policy elsewhere in the empire. The recruitment of foreign fighters altered existing power dynamics. Mercenary groups required payment, land, or political autonomy in exchange for service. As Roman fiscal systems collapsed, local leaders struggled to meet these demands. Later sources describe breakdowns in these arrangements, resulting in violence and territorial seizures. While the precise chronology remains debated, material evidence indicates increasing Germanic presence in eastern Britain by the mid-5th century. Within Britain, authority increasingly rested with regional leaders capable of mobilizing armed followers. These figures are often described by modern scholars as warlords, though the term reflects analytical convenience rather than contemporary designation. Power derived from land control, kinship networks, and military success. Leadership was personal and situational, lacking the institutional continuity of Roman governance. Alliances formed and dissolved in response to immediate threats rather than long-term political structures. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of localized militarization. Hill forts abandoned during the Roman period were reoccupied in several regions, particularly in western Britain. Sites such as South Cadbury show signs of refortification and elite activity during the 5th and 6th centuries. These fortifications suggest defensive strategies oriented toward regional control and protection rather than imperial frontier defense. Before Arthur was written, he was remembered. In early medieval Wales, the preservation of the past did not rely on archives, chronicles, or administrative records. Instead, memory was carried through spoken performance, structured verse, and genealogical recitation. In a society where literacy was limited and centralized institutions were absent, oral tradition served as the primary means of transmitting history, identity, and legitimacy across generations. This oral culture developed within a political environment shaped by fragmentation and competition. Post-Roman Britain lacked a unifying authority, and Welsh-speaking regions were divided into small kingdoms and territorial units. In this context, the past functioned as a resource. Claims to land, leadership, and status were reinforced by remembered ancestry and heroic precedent. Oral tradition provided a flexible yet authoritative framework through which communities could interpret their origins and justify present power structures. Central to this system were professional poets, commonly referred to as bards. These individuals occupied a recognized social role within early Welsh society. Their function extended beyond entertainment. They were custodians of collective memory. Through formal training, bards learned complex metrical structures and extensive repertoires of verse. Their performances reinforced social hierarchies, celebrated patrons, and preserved narratives of conflict and alliance. Genealogical poetry was among the most politically significant forms of oral tradition. Lineage determined legitimacy, and recited ancestry linked contemporary rulers to heroic or semi-legendary predecessors. These genealogies were not static records. They were shaped by present needs, emphasizing certain connections while omitting others. Over time, this process compressed chronology, merging generations and elevating prominent figures to archetypal status. Heroic verse functioned alongside genealogy to memorialize conflict. Battles, raids, and acts of leadership were preserved in poetic form, often emphasizing valor, loyalty, and martial success. These poems did not aim to record events with chronological precision. Instead, they conveyed meaning through selection and emphasis, highlighting outcomes that reinforced communal identity. One of the earliest surviving examples of this tradition is Y Gododdin, attributed to the poet Aneurin and dated, in its written form, to the late 6th or early 7th century. The poem commemorates a warband from the kingdom of Gododdin who fell in battle against Anglian forces, traditionally associated with the Battle of Cattraeth. Although the poem survives in later medieval manuscripts, linguistic analysis suggests it preserves much older material. Y Gododdin is notable for its focus on individual warriors rather than centralized command. The poem names heroes, describes their feats, and situates them within a shared cultural framework of honor and loss. Arthur is not mentioned explicitly, but the poem demonstrates how military leadership and collective memory were encoded in verse. It also illustrates how oral tradition could preserve the reputation of individuals long after their deaths. Another important figure associated with early Welsh poetic tradition is Taliesin. Poems attributed to him survive in later compilations and reflect a mixture of praise poetry, mythological material, and political commentary. While the historical Taliesin remains difficult to isolate, the corpus associated with his name reveals how poetic authority itself could become legendary. The attribution of poems to a single renowned bard enhanced their credibility and reach. The transmission of these poems over centuries involved repeated performance and adaptation. Each recitation introduced opportunities for modification. Language evolved, references shifted, and narratives were reshaped to suit new audiences. As a result, oral tradition preserved thematic continuity while allowing factual details to change. This process explains why later texts present heroic figures whose attributes reflect multiple periods simultaneously. Chronological compression is a defining feature of oral heroic culture. Events separated by decades or even centuries could be remembered as contemporaneous. Distinct conflicts were merged into singular narratives of prolonged struggle. Leaders who may never have met were portrayed as rivals or allies. This compression created coherent stories at the expense of precise dating. The absence of writing also meant that silence in the record does not imply insignificance. Figures who left no archaeological trace could still occupy central positions in remembered history. Conversely, individuals of historical importance might disappear entirely if their memory was not preserved through verse or genealogy. Survival in oral tradition depended on narrative usefulness rather than administrative relevance. Oral memory was also shaped by performance context. Poems were delivered in halls, courts, and communal gatherings. The audience influenced content, favoring stories that reinforced shared values or current political concerns. This interactive process ensured that tradition remained relevant, but it also encouraged embellishment. Heroic qualities were amplified, failures minimized, and ambiguous outcomes resolved in favor of moral clarity. Despite these transformations, oral tradition was not arbitrary. Its structure imposed constraints. Meter, formulaic expressions, and established themes limited deviation. These constraints allowed for continuity across generations, even as details shifted. The persistence of certain narrative patterns suggests long-term stability in how early Welsh society conceptualized leadership and conflict. By the 6th and 7th centuries, oral tradition had begun to intersect with literacy. Monastic centers introduced writing, initially for religious purposes. Some oral material was recorded, though often selectively and through the lens of Christian scholarship. This transition marked a significant change in how memory was preserved. Written texts fixed versions of stories that had previously been fluid. Arthur enters history not as a ruler, but as a name attached to victory. The earliest written references to Arthur appear not in contemporary Roman records or 5th century chronicles, but in texts composed several centuries after the period they describe. These sources emerge from early medieval Wales, where oral tradition had already shaped collective memory before being committed to writing. As a result, Arthur's first appearances belong to a literary historical environment defined by retrospection rather than documentation. One of the most frequently cited sources is the Historia Brittonum, traditionally attributed to a Welsh cleric named Nennius and compiled around the early 9th century, approximately c. 830 CE. This text is not a conventional history in the Roman sense. Instead, it is a compilation of genealogies, legends, and historical fragments intended to construct a coherent past for the Brittonic peoples. Within this framework, Arthur appears as a dux bellorum, or leader of battles, rather than a king. The Historia Brittonum lists 12 battles fought by Arthur against Saxon adversaries, culminating in the Battle of Mount Badon. The text emphasizes Arthur's military role, describing him as bearing the image of Christ on his shoulders, or shield, during combat. This detail reflects Christian symbolism rather than eyewitness reporting, indicating that the account is shaped by theological interpretation as much as by memory of conflict. Crucially, Arthur is not presented as a monarch exercising territorial rule. No court, capital, or administrative system is described. Authority is defined entirely through warfare. This portrayal aligns with the political realities of post-Roman Britain, where leadership was often situational and tied to military success rather than institutional governance. The text situates Arthur alongside other British leaders, suggesting coordination rather than centralized kingship. The geographic scope of the 12 battles presents significant challenges for historical interpretation. Locations range widely across Britain, from the River Glane to Mount Badon, whose precise identification remains disputed. Scholars note that the dispersion of these sites may reflect narrative accumulation rather than a literal campaign. The listing of battles likely serves to emphasize repeated success rather than to provide a reliable itinerary. Another key source is the Annals Cambri or Welsh Annals, compiled in the 10th century but drawing on earlier material. These annals provide brief chronological entries rather than narrative accounts. Under the year traditionally corresponding to 516 CE, they record the Battle of Badon, noting that Arthur carried the cross of Christ for 3 days and nights and that the Britons were victorious. A later entry, dated to 537 CE, records the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medraut fell. The annalistic format lends an appearance of chronological precision, but modern scholarship approaches these dates cautiously. The annals were compiled centuries after the events and rely on retrospective calculation rather than contemporary record-keeping. Variations in dating systems and manuscript transmission further complicate attempts to align these entries with archaeological or historical evidence. The Battle of Badon occupies a central place in early Arthurian tradition. It is referenced by Gildas in his 6th century sermon De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, though Arthur is not named. Gildas describes a decisive British victory that temporarily halted Saxon expansion, placing it within living memory of his own generation. Later texts associate Arthur with this victory, effectively attaching his name to a well-remembered event. This association illustrates how oral tradition and written history intersect. A historically attested battle becomes linked to a named hero in later sources, providing narrative focus and continuity. The absence of Arthur's name in Gildas does not preclude his existence, but it underscores the gap between event and attribution. The process reflects how heroic figures could emerge as focal points for collective memory. The Historia Brittonum and Annals Cambri were produced in a political context that favored such constructions. Early medieval Welsh polities faced pressure from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and sought to assert their legitimacy and historical depth. By emphasizing past victories over Saxons, these texts reinforced a narrative of resistance and endurance. Arthur functions within this framework as a symbol of successful opposition rather than as a detailed historical actor. It is also significant that these sources do not present Arthur in isolation. He is embedded within a broader network of British leaders, saints, and genealogies. This integration suggests that Arthur was not originally conceived as a singular founder figure, but as part of a collective tradition of martial leadership. Only later would his role expand beyond this context. The language used to describe Arthur in these texts reflects the conventions of early medieval historiography. Supernatural elements are limited compared to later romances, but religious symbolism is prominent. Victory is framed as divinely sanctioned, aligning military success with Christian righteousness. This framing serves both theological and political purposes, reinforcing the moral legitimacy of British resistance. Archaeological evidence does not directly corroborate the specific battles listed in these sources. No material remains can be conclusively linked to Mount Badon or Camlan. However, broader archaeological patterns, such as fortified sites, weapon finds, and settlement disruption, support the existence of sustained conflict during the period described. The texts align with these patterns at a general level, even if their details remain unverifiable. Scholars therefore treat these early Arthurian references as neither pure invention nor reliable chronicle. They are understood as products of memory shaped by oral tradition, political need, and religious interpretation. The figure of Arthur emerges gradually, defined by function rather than biography. He is a warrior associated with victory, coordination, and resistance, not yet a king or lawgiver. Arthur became a king when Britain needed one. By the early 12th century, Britain had undergone profound transformation. The Norman conquest of 1066 had imposed a new aristocracy, reorganized land tenure, and introduced continental legal and administrative structures. Anglo-Saxon polities had been supplanted, and Norman rulers faced the challenge of consolidating authority across a culturally fragmented island. Establishing continuity with the pre-conquest past became a political and ideological necessity, as legitimacy in the eyes of both the local population and the continental court depended on demonstrating historical depth. It is within this context that Geoffrey of Monmouth produced his Historia Regum Britanniae, completed around 1136 CE. Geoffrey, a cleric with connections to the ecclesiastical and intellectual networks of southwest Wales and England, compiled a work that blended folklore, oral memory, and classical historiography. His purpose was not strictly documentary. Rather, he constructed a pseudo-historical narrative designed to unify disparate traditions into a coherent account of Britain's past. Norman rulers were acutely aware of the power of history in legitimizing authority. Castles and administrative reforms could enforce compliance, but historical narrative provided symbolic justification. By presenting the Britons as a people with a continuous line of kings stretching back to Trojan settlement, Geoffrey offered the Normans a framework in which conquest could be framed as succession rather than rupture. This historical continuity allowed the new elite to anchor their rule in a deep temporal context, linking contemporary governance to a celebrated and heroic past. The political landscape of 12th century Britain was unstable. Resistance to Norman authority persisted in regions such as Wales, Cornwall, and parts of northern England. Local elites retained influence, and cultural memory of pre-conquest polities remained strong. In this environment, a constructed history that emphasized past kings, national victories, and heroic figures functioned as a tool to shape perception, strengthen loyalty, and negotiate identity among subjugated populations. Geoffrey's approach reflects broader intellectual currents of the period. 12th century Europe experienced a resurgence of interest in history, genealogy, and chronicle writing, often with moral and didactic aims. Works by chroniclers such as William of Malmesbury and Orderic Vitalis demonstrate a fusion of observation, moral commentary, and literary style. Geoffrey's contribution is distinctive in its imaginative synthesis of multiple sources, including local Welsh tradition, oral legend, and fragments of classical and medieval history. Within Historia Regum Britanniae, Arthur emerges as a central figure not merely because of historical memory, but because the narrative demanded a symbolic hero. In Geoffrey's account, Arthur is no longer simply a military leader. He is elevated to kingship, ruling a unified Britain, defending it from external enemies, and establishing law and governance. This transformation reflects the political imperatives of Geoffrey's context, a need for exemplars of rulership capable of legitimizing continuity amidst conquest and cultural change. The text also demonstrates a conscious blending of sources. Geoffrey drew upon early Welsh genealogies, annals, and heroic verse, yet adapted them to serve narrative and political objectives. Events and individuals from oral tradition were reorganized into linear chronology, assigning kingship to figures previously described as warriors or regional leaders. Classical influences, such as Trojan origin myths, provided a framework that linked Britain to wider European and Mediterranean history, reinforcing the notion of a prestigious and ancient lineage. Norman audiences, familiar with continental epic and romance traditions, would have recognized the literary qualities of Geoffrey's narrative. The work situates Arthur and other British kings within a succession of legendary rulers, emphasizing martial prowess, justice, and dynastic legitimacy. These characteristics aligned with contemporary ideals of rulership, resonating with both noble and clerical audiences. The narrative functions simultaneously as history, entertainment, and political reinforcement. The incorporation of Christian motifs further augmented the text's authority. Kings and warriors are often depicted as instruments of divine will, their victories sanctioned by providence. This moral dimension provides both cohesion and legitimacy, positioning Geoffrey's historical figures within a framework comprehensible to ecclesiastical authorities and lay readers alike. Arthur's victories over the Saxons, for example, are not only military achievements but demonstrations of divine favor, reinforcing the political and spiritual order. Geoffrey's narrative strategy extended beyond the figure of Arthur. By establishing a continuous line of kings, culminating in Arthur's reign, the Historia created a conceptual map of British political development. This map provided context for subsequent events and rulers, linking contemporary claims to the ancient past. In doing so, Geoffrey offered a historical lens through which Norman rulers could view their authority as part of a long-standing tradition of British governance, rather than as abrupt foreign imposition. The reception of Geoffrey's work was immediate and widespread. Manuscripts circulated quickly, and his account became a reference point for later chroniclers, historians, and poets. The text's popularity reflects both its narrative appeal and its utility in constructing political identity. By situating Arthur within a framework of kingship, law, and conquest, Geoffrey transformed a collection of regional legends into a national myth with enduring influence. It is important to note that Geoffrey's Arthur differs fundamentally from earlier Welsh accounts. Whereas the Historia Brittonum and Annals Cambri present Arthur as a martial leader, Geoffrey presents him as a sovereign, diplomat, and empire builder. This shift reflects the literary and political needs of 12th century Britain, rather than evidence of historical fact. The elevation of Arthur to kingship aligns with Norman and continental notions of monarchy, centralization, and dynastic legitimacy. Geoffrey's work also demonstrates the interplay between history and invention. While drawing upon memory and tradition, he exercises significant authorial control, reorganizing events, elaborating genealogies, and introducing new episodes. Battles, journeys, and legal reforms are described with a narrative consistency absent from earlier sources. This combination of compilation and invention allows the Historia to function as both historical framework and literary creation. By situating Arthur in this context, Geoffrey provides the first fully realized narrative of a British king whose authority extends beyond regional warfare. Arthur's reign is marked by conquest, consolidation, and lawmaking, establishing a model of rulership that would shape subsequent literature and historiography. The text presents a coherent political landscape, linking past and present, hero and institution, legend and governance. The immediate effect of Geoffrey's narrative was the permanent redefinition of Arthur. Where earlier sources preserved memory selectively and episodically, the Historia Regum Britanniae codified his identity, situating him as a unifying figure for both historical reflection and literary elaboration. Subsequent writers, including Wass, Lyman, and continental chroniclers, would expand upon this foundation, creating the complex Arthurian corpus that dominates medieval imagination. Geoffrey's political context thus directly shaped his narrative choices. The need for legitimacy, continuity, and cultural coherence in post-conquest Britain created conditions under which Arthur could be elevated from a remembered warrior to a king of mythic stature. The interplay between Norman rule, Welsh tradition, and continental historiography produced a text that was at once scholarly, imaginative, and politically functional. This was not memory, it was myth-making. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, Arthur emerges as more than a regional war leader. He is portrayed as a sovereign with authority over a centralized court, a ruler whose dominion rivals that of Rome itself. The narrative situates Arthur at the apex of political and military hierarchy, establishing a model of kingship both unprecedented in earlier Welsh sources and entirely consonant with 12th century European expectations of monarchy. Geoffrey constructs this imperial figure through a combination of genealogical exposition and narrative framing. Arthur's ancestry is traced meticulously, linking him to a line of British kings and, indirectly, to Trojan forebears. This lineage legitimizes his claim to supreme authority while situating Britain within a broader classical and European historical framework. The genealogy serves both literary and political purposes, asserting continuity with a heroic past while conforming to the expectations of a literate and Norman-influenced audience. The text chronicles Arthur's military campaigns in detail, describing conquests across Britain and continental territories. He is depicted as systematically subduing rebellious kingdoms, defending his borders against Saxons, and extending influence beyond traditional British boundaries. Geoffrey's narrative frames these campaigns not merely as episodic skirmishes, but as a coordinated program of expansion and consolidation, reflecting ideals of empire familiar from Roman historiography. Arthur's court, as described by Geoffrey, functions as the center of administration, judgment, and counsel. The depiction of a centralized seat of power contrasts sharply with the localized authority evident in post-Roman Britain. Arthur presides over nobles, receives envoys, and administers law, creating the image of a ruler whose legitimacy derives from both martial prowess and institutional control. This centralization is narrative-driven, serving to unify disparate events and characters into a coherent story of kingship. Integral to Geoffrey's construction are episodes of betrayal and internal conflict. The rebellion of Mordred Medraut exemplifies the vulnerability of empire to treachery, while Arthur's response illustrates his capacity for leadership under duress. Such narrative elements establish a rise and fall arc, providing structural cohesion to the story. This framework, ascension, conquest, betrayal, and decline, would become a defining feature of Arthurian tradition in all subsequent literary developments. The literary Arthur created by Geoffrey is widely recognized by scholars as a product of invention rather than historical reconstruction. While rooted in Welsh oral memory, the text embellishes, reorganizes, and systematizes the figure to suit narrative and ideological objectives. Battles, territories, and alliances are constructed to enhance the impression of imperial authority, and chronology is compressed to present a continuous and cohesive reign. Geoffrey's choices reflect a conscious effort to align Arthur with Roman imperial imagery. By depicting him as an emperor of Britain, defending the realm, extending dominion, and instituting law, Geoffrey situates Arthur within a symbolic framework that parallels continental notions of kingship and empire. The text emphasizes order, justice, and divine favor as foundations of authority, echoing the political and theological discourse of 12th century Europe. The narrative also integrates mythic and legendary elements into historical structure. Arthur's victories are frequently accompanied by extraordinary feats, supernatural interventions, or emblematic objects, such as his shield bearing a sacred image. While these features were limited compared to later medieval romances, they mark a deliberate blending of memory, legend, and literary invention, demonstrating how Geoffrey transformed earlier heroic material into epic-scale monarchy. Geoffrey's approach to warfare underscores this imperial vision. Campaigns are presented systematically. Enemies are identified, regions conquered, and the outcomes integrated into a broader narrative of territorial unification. Unlike the episodic and geographically fragmented battles of earlier Welsh sources, these campaigns convey strategic cohesion, emphasizing Arthur's role as an organizing force rather than as one among many competing leaders. The cumulative effect is the portrayal of a Britain united under a single centralized authority. Legal and administrative functions also serve to reinforce Arthur's kingship. Geoffrey describes assemblies, judgment processes, and delegation of authority, implying a functioning government capable of sustaining empire. While these depictions are literary constructions, they convey contemporary ideals of rulership, framing Arthur as a paradigm of effective governance. His authority encompasses both coercive and administrative power, demonstrating the full scope of monarchy as conceived in 12th century Britain. The narrative arc concludes with betrayal, internal conflict, and eventual death. Mordred's uprising destabilizes the empire and culminates in the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur is mortally wounded. Geoffrey presents this sequence as both inevitable and narratively satisfying, emphasizing the fragility of human authority, even when sanctioned by ancestry, martial skill, and divine favor. The story provides closure while preserving the heroic stature of Arthur, allowing him to occupy a symbolic space beyond historical constraints. This structural design, the rise, consolidation, betrayal, and fall, would become the template for virtually all subsequent Arthurian literature. Geoffrey establishes the core elements: the hero king, the courtly center, the unification of Britain, martial and diplomatic prowess, internal treachery, and eventual death. Each component reinforces the notion of kingship as a narrative and ideological construct, linking personal valor to institutional authority and societal cohesion. Arthur stopped fighting and began presiding. By the late 12th century, the Arthurian legend had crossed from Britain to northern France, where the literary culture of the court transformed the story's focus. This period saw the rise of the chivalric romance, a genre that emphasized individual heroism, courtly behavior, and moral testing rather than the martial leadership of kings. In this context, Arthur himself became largely static, a symbolic ruler whose primary function was to preside over a court of knights rather than to engage in campaigns of conquest. Chrétien de Troyes, active during the second half of the 12th century, was central to this transformation. His romances, composed in the Champagne and Picardy regions under aristocratic patronage, introduced enduring narrative innovations. Most notably, Chrétien developed the character of Lancelot, whose exploits combine martial skill with the ethical and emotional demands of courtly love. This narrative innovation shifted emphasis from collective military action to personal trials and moral achievement. In Chrétien's works, Arthur functions primarily as a framework for knightly adventure. He establishes the court, convenes tournaments, and adjudicates disputes, but rarely participates directly in quests. This narrative choice reflects a literary and social context in which aristocratic audiences valued individual heroism and moral discernment as central to cultural identity. Knights' adventures, rather than battles for territory, now drive the narrative forward. The emergence of romantic love as a narrative motif marked a decisive departure from earlier tradition. Lancelot's relationship with Guinevere introduces themes of loyalty, desire, and ethical conflict. Romantic entanglements are depicted as tests of character, requiring knights to reconcile personal passion with social and moral obligations. This integration of love and ethics aligns with broader courtly norms and illustrates the intersection of literature and social ideology in 12th century France. Chrétien also emphasized the moral and spiritual development of individual knights. Quests were designed to evaluate courage, loyalty, and fidelity, often through trials involving supernatural or symbolic elements. The narrative purpose was pedagogical as well as entertaining, offering exemplars of virtuous behavior for aristocratic audiences. In this framework, Arthur presides over a moral universe, providing authority and order without directly shaping each outcome. The geographic and political context of Chrétien's audience influenced the depiction of Arthurian Britain. France at this time was fragmented into feudal domains, and the notion of a centralized monarch presiding over a court resonated with emerging ideals of lordship and governance. Arthurian Britain was reimagined not as a contested post-Roman territory but as a model of courtly stability and hierarchical order, suitable for reflection and emulation by contemporary aristocrats. Chrétien's innovation of narrative structure also contributed to this transformation. Stories are episodic, focusing on discrete quests rather than extended campaigns of conquest. Each adventure tests the protagonist's abilities and virtues independently, creating a modular narrative that can be recombined, expanded, or adapted. This episodic approach contrasts with Geoffrey's integrated chronicle, where the king's reign and military conquests drive the overarching historical narrative. The portrayal of Arthur himself is illustrative of this narrative shift. As presiding monarch, he embodies legitimacy, justice, and social order. His authority is exercised symbolically rather than practically, reflecting an aristocratic ideal in which the king functions as the guarantor of moral and political norms, rather than as an active participant in warfare. The court becomes a stage for demonstration of knightly excellence, codifying ideals of honor and duty for the readership. Chrétien also integrated motifs from broader European literary culture. Elements of Breton lie, classical exempla, and continental epic appear alongside localized Celtic material, producing a hybrid narrative that emphasized universal ideals. Arthurian Britain is thus transformed from a geographic and historical entity into a literary and ethical landscape, where quests, trials, and moral dilemmas dominate the imaginative space. The introduction of Lancelot illustrates the shift from collective martial heroism to individual ethical agency. Lancelot's feats in combat remain significant, but they are intertwined with personal choice, loyalty, and relational responsibility. The hero's success is measured not only in military terms but in the ability to navigate complex moral and social environments. Romance, therefore, becomes a mechanism for exploring individual development within a codified ethical framework. Courtly love also reshapes narrative temporality. Rather than following the linear succession of battles and reigns, narratives trace emotional and ethical trajectories over the course of discrete adventures. This temporal compression allows for deeper focus on character development and internal conflict. Arthur's court provides a stable temporal anchor, enabling episodic exploration while maintaining coherence in the larger literary framework. The influence of Crétine's romances extended beyond France. Manuscripts circulated widely, and his treatment of Arthurian material was adapted into Latin, Anglo-Norman, and Middle English texts. Themes of knightly trials, love, and moral development were adopted and transformed in subsequent works, including the Vulgate cycle and later Middle English prose romances. The literary and ethical reorientation established in this period persisted for centuries, shaping the trajectory of Arthurian legend across Europe. Arthur's role as presiding monarch also reflects changing social expectations of leadership. Whereas post-Roman and early Welsh tradition emphasized martial coordination and military legitimacy, 12th-century aristocratic audiences were interested in symbolic authority, ceremonial function, and moral oversight. The king's authority derives from his capacity to maintain order, judge disputes, and provide narrative and social coherence within the courtly world. This model situates Arthur as both a narrative and cultural stabilizer. The courtly transformation of the Arthurian world is also evident in the representation of women. Figures such as Guinevere, Elaine, and other noble ladies function as catalysts for knightly virtue, testing loyalty, courage, and ethical judgment. These interactions reinforce the integration of social and moral norms into the narrative, reflecting aristocratic preoccupations with honor, relational obligation, and the refinement of personal conduct. Arthur's presence as an adjudicating and ceremonial figure ensures the maintenance of these norms. Geographically, Crétine abstracts Britain from historical specificity. Localities are stylized rather than precise, serving as settings for moral and martial trials rather than realistic historical space. The narrative focus is ethical and literary rather than documentary. Arthur's empire, therefore, becomes a stage upon which the ideals of knighthood and courtly conduct can be explored systematically, rather than a reconstructed post-Roman polity. The greatest quest was no longer victory, but worthiness. By the late 12th century, the Arthurian legend underwent a further transformation in French literary culture with the introduction of the Holy Grail. The Grail emerges not as a martial objective or a territorial conquest, but as a spiritual and moral challenge. Its narrative function reflects a shift from physical heroism to the testing of inner virtue, aligning the Arthurian corpus with contemporary Christian ideals of purity, divine favor, and ethical conduct. The earliest fully developed Grail narratives appear in the Vulgate cycle, or Lancelot Grail cycle, produced in northern France between approximately 1210 and 1230 CE. These texts integrate and expand upon Crétine de Troyes' unfinished work, Perceval, the story of the Grail, which first presents the Grail as a mysterious, sacred object encountered by a knight on quest. In these narratives, the Grail functions as a symbolic focus for testing worthiness, self-discipline, and spiritual insight. Christian interpretation was central to the Grail's narrative role. Knights' quests are no longer primarily defined by military skill or territorial ambition. They are defined by their capacity to align personal conduct with divine principles. The Grail represents purity, obedience, and grace, and its successful attainment signifies both moral and spiritual legitimacy. The narrative emphasizes that physical courage alone is insufficient. Ethical and spiritual discernment are required to achieve the ultimate goal. Scholars note that the Grail motif overlays earlier Celtic traditions of sacred objects and otherworldly vessels. In pre-Christian narratives, similar motifs may have functioned as sources of sustenance, magical power, or symbolic authority. Christian authors adapted these motifs, recasting them as tools for moral instruction. The Grail thus exemplifies the synthesis of native legend and ecclesiastical ideology, demonstrating how earlier heroic material could be reinterpreted to convey religious and ethical significance. The role of the Grail in these narratives also reflects the codification of knighthood as a spiritual as well as martial institution. Characters such as Perceval, Galahad, and Bors are tested through trials that emphasize humility, chastity, and devotion. Failures and successes are framed in relation to divine judgment, producing a moral universe in which the worthiness of the knight determines narrative outcomes. Arthur's court provides the social context for these quests, maintaining the hierarchical structure of authority within which moral lessons are enacted. Integration of the Grail into the broader narrative of Arthurian romance also involves temporal and structural complexity. Quests occur simultaneously or sequentially, with narrative arcs converging around central ethical challenges. The Grail narrative intersects with existing themes of courtly love, loyalty, and chivalric honor, creating a layered moral landscape. These interactions allow authors to explore tension between personal desire, ethical duty, and communal responsibility, producing a multidimensional heroic model. The Grail's function as a moral and spiritual test transforms narrative priorities. In earlier sources, battles, conquest, and loyalty to king were paramount. In Grail-centered romances, the focus shifts to individual ethical development. Success is measured not in land gained or enemies defeated, but in the alignment of knightly behavior with divine will. This reorientation reinforces the integration of Arthurian legend with broader European Christian literary culture. Geographically and politically, the Grail narrative abstracts Britain from historical specificity. Locality is subordinated to allegorical and symbolic function. The quest traverses idealized landscapes that serve as moral and ethical arenas rather than precise topographical realities. Arthur's kingdom, while present, functions as the organizational hub from which knights depart and return, preserving narrative coherence without requiring historical verisimilitude. Christian symbolism is pervasive in descriptions of both the Grail and the knights who pursue it. Perceval's hesitation, Galahad's purity, and the trials imposed upon others are consistently framed within theological discourse. The Grail itself is described with sacred imagery, often associated with Christ, the Eucharist, or angelic beings. These motifs reinforce the narrative's pedagogical dimension, demonstrating that the story serves as a vehicle for ethical and spiritual instruction as much as entertainment. The Grail also functions as a mechanism for codifying ideals of behavior within the chivalric class. By providing a standard of conduct against which knights are measured, the Grail establishes a moral hierarchy analogous to the political hierarchy of Arthur's court. Success is contingent not solely upon martial ability, but upon the integration of virtue, spiritual insight, and obedience to both temporal and divine authority. This dual hierarchy mirrors contemporary societal structures and reinforces the didactic purpose of the literature. Narrative emphasis on failure and human imperfection underscores the Grail's function as moral allegory. Many knights attempt the quest and fail, illustrating that excellence is rare and contingent upon both spiritual and ethical preparation. Failures are instructive, serving as cautionary exemplars for audiences. In this manner, the Grail narratives extend the didactic function of Arthurian romance beyond heroic exploits to encompass moral and theological education. The relationship between Arthur and the Grail is indirect but structurally significant. Arthur organizes his court, convenes tournaments, and adjudicates disputes, providing a social framework for ethical testing. His role as presiding monarch reinforces hierarchical and normative order but leaves the spiritual challenge of the Grail primarily to individual knights. This narrative distribution emphasizes personal responsibility, ethical autonomy, and the interplay between collective authority and individual moral agency. The Grail also interacts with motifs of loyalty, secrecy, and divine revelation. Knights who demonstrate faithfulness, humility, or prudence receive guidance or revelation. Those who act impulsively or pridefully encounter failure. These motifs highlight the integration of narrative, moral instruction, and theological reflection, demonstrating the sophistication of 12th and 13th century French literary culture in constructing multi-layered narrative systems. The integration of Celtic and Christian elements exemplifies how Arthurian legend evolved through adaptation and reinterpretation. Earlier heroic motifs provided narrative substance, while Christian symbolism supplied ethical direction and allegorical weight. The resulting narratives operate simultaneously on multiple levels, as adventure tales, as courtly romances, and as spiritual allegories. This complexity distinguishes the Grail romances from earlier martial-focused Arthurian texts. The Grail's impact extends beyond narrative content to the structural organization of romance. Individual quests, episodic trials, and convergent moral lessons produce an integrated literary system in which knights' experiences reflect broader cultural and spiritual ideals. This system reinforces the courtly and ethical architecture established by Chrétien de Troyes, while expanding its theological and allegorical dimension. Arthur's court functions as the stage upon which spiritual ideals are enacted and evaluated. The development of Grail-centered romance had lasting implications for European literature. Later cycles, including the Vulgate and post-Vulgate adaptations, amplified and codified these motifs, emphasizing spiritual and moral themes alongside traditional adventure. Christianized quests shaped audience expectations, establishing the Grail as an enduring symbol of virtue, divine favor, and ethical testing in the Arthurian corpus. The Grail narratives exemplify the broader literary transformation of the legend, from historical memory and martial heroism to symbolic and moral literature. Success is no longer defined solely by battlefield achievement but by ethical alignment and spiritual insight. Arthur remains central as presiding monarch, but the narrative focus has shifted decisively to the knightly individual and the ethical and religious framework within which action occurs. Camelot was never a place, it was a theory. By the 13th century, the Arthurian narrative had expanded to include detailed representations of courtly life, of which the Round Table is the most enduring symbol. Described in both the Vulgate cycle and subsequent prose romances, the Round Table functions as a conceptual instrument rather than a literal institution. It embodies ideals of equality, justice, and collective responsibility among Arthur's knights, presenting a model of governance designed to reinforce moral and social order within a narrative framework. The Round Table eliminates the conventional hierarchy that structured contemporary aristocratic courts. Knights sit as equals around a circular table, symbolizing the absence of precedence and privileging collaborative deliberation. This narrative choice reflects literary and political aspirations rather than historical precedent. Medieval chroniclers and romance writers employed the Round Table as a symbolic device to explore notions of ethical leadership, collective accountability, and the reconciliation of personal ambition with communal obligation. Arthur's role within this idealized court is presiding rather than participatory. He adjudicates disputes, organizes campaigns, and convenes councils, functioning as both sovereign and arbiter. While the knight's individual exploits constitute the narrative focus, Arthur's authority provides coherence, reinforcing the connection between ethical behavior, martial prowess, and institutional legitimacy. The Round Table thus links symbolic equality to the broader social hierarchy, situating Arthur as a stabilizing figure. The conceptual significance of the Round Table extends to legal and ethical dimensions. Disputes among knights, challenges of loyalty, and enforcement of chivalric codes are mediated within this framework. The narrative presents these interactions as tests of governance, illustrating the tensions between individual action and collective responsibility. Arthur's judgments are framed as exemplars of justice, demonstrating the integration of moral authority with social organization. The idealized court also served didactic functions for medieval audiences. Romance narratives emphasized ethical conduct, loyalty, and honor, providing models for aristocratic behavior. By situating these lessons within the Round Table, authors created a spatial and symbolic locus for examining the interaction of personal virtue, social expectation, and political stability. Knights' actions are evaluated in relation to both ethical norms and institutional frameworks, highlighting the interdependence of moral and structural order. The Round Table's symbolic value was enhanced by literary codification. Texts describe precise seating arrangements, ritualized conduct, and ceremonial roles, establishing a framework for narrative coherence. These conventions allowed authors to explore hierarchical ideals within a spatial metaphor, linking spatial organization to ethical and political principles. The circular design reinforces unity, balance, and shared responsibility, in contrast to conventional feudal hierarchies characterized by rigid precedents and privilege. Historical analogues are limited but instructive. Some scholars suggest parallels with courtly councils and advisory assemblies in contemporary European polities, where collective deliberation and ceremonial representation functioned alongside hierarchical authority. The Round Table amplifies these realities into a narrative abstraction, idealizing equality while maintaining the king as a central authority. This literary device allows the Arthurian court to operate as a theoretical space for examining governance, ethics, and social cohesion. The narrative also emphasizes ritual and ceremony as components of political legitimacy. Feasts, tournaments, and council meetings are described in structured detail, reinforcing the performative aspects of governance. Knights' adherence to rules of conduct and ceremonial expectation is integral to the narrative of moral and political order. The Round Table, therefore, is not merely symbolic but functions as a framework within which social norms, ethical standards, and political authority intersect. Authors further link the Round Table to Arthurian moral ideals through the inclusion of quests, trials, and challenges. Knights' individual journeys and ethical tests are contextualized within the courtly structure, with successes and failures interpreted as reflections on collective governance. The Round Table provides a locus for measuring achievement, adjudicating disputes, and reinforcing the normative framework of chivalric society. Its narrative function thus combines political symbolism with moral pedagogy. The ideal of collective equality is contrasted with the inevitability of human imperfection. Narratives frequently depict discord, jealousy, and betrayal among knights, illustrating the tension between aspiration and practice. The Round Table, while symbolically perfect, cannot prevent failure or moral lapse. These episodes serve as reminders that institutional ideals are contingent upon the ethical behavior of participants and highlight the limitations of symbolic governance when confronted with human ambition and error. Integration of the Round Table into the broader Arthurian narrative demonstrates its literary versatility. It serves as the organizational center, the ethical framework, and the symbolic embodiment of chivalric values. The table's circular design and collective seating provide spatial and structural cohesion, enabling authors to manage multiple narrative threads, interweaving quests, romances, and moral dilemmas within a unified symbolic architecture. Moreover, the Round Table functions as a narrative mirror of social aspiration. Medieval audiences, particularly aristocratic readers and patrons, could engage with its ideals as a reflection of aspirational governance, ethical behavior, and moral community. While historical precedent for such equality among knights is minimal, the Round Table offered a conceptual model for negotiating ideals of loyalty, service, and collective responsibility within a hierarchical society. The kingdom fell from within. Where the Round Table embodies ideals of equality and justice, the narrative of Camelot's collapse emphasizes the fragility of those ideals under the pressures of human ambition, desire, and internal contradiction. Central to this collapse is Mordred, whose rebellion functions as a literary device illustrating the vulnerability of hierarchical and ethical structures. Within the Vulgate cycle and later Middle English adaptations, Mordred's betrayal is not merely a plot mechanism. It represents the inherent tension between symbolic ideals and the realities of political authority. Mordred's insurrection is precipitated by a combination of dynastic ambition and personal grievance. Accounts vary, but consistently he challenges Arthur's authority from within, exploiting lapses in loyalty and the structural dependencies of the court. Unlike external invasions or military defeat, this threat originates from the inner workings of Camelot itself, highlighting the narrative logic that ethical and political cohesion cannot be guaranteed solely by structural idealization. Internal agency, ambition, and human fallibility are primary causal factors in the kingdom's disintegration. Lancelot's affair with Queen Guinevere compounds these internal strains. While framed as a matter of courtly romance in many narratives, the relationship has political ramifications, undermining trust among knights and destabilizing governance. The affair illustrates the intersection of personal desire and institutional responsibility, demonstrating that ethical lapses can have systemic consequences. Narrative emphasis on these interpersonal dynamics reinforces the theme that collapse is generated internally rather than imposed externally. The interplay of betrayal, jealousy, and ambition is depicted through cascading conflicts among Arthur's closest knights. Knights who once exemplified chivalric ideals are drawn into factionalism, further fracturing the symbolic unity of the Round Table. The narrative presents a feedback loop. Individual failures provoke institutional weakness, which in turn permits additional failures. This depiction reinforces the structural logic of Camelot as an aspirational but ultimately contingent system. Arthur's responses to these crises are instructive. He exercises authority, adjudicates disputes, and mobilizes loyal forces, yet the narrative emphasizes the limits of his capacity to enforce justice. Even the king, whose symbolic and practical authority underpins the court, cannot fully constrain human ambition or desire. In this sense, the collapse of Camelot serves as a narrative exploration of the tension between idealized governance and the practical limitations imposed by human behavior. Geographically and narratively, the internal conflicts concentrate within Camelot and its surrounding territories. This localization underscores the symbolic rather than military nature of the collapse. Unlike earlier depictions of Britain's post-Roman fragmentation, where external invasions dominate, the narrative here emphasizes ethical and political disintegration within an organized courtly framework. The story reframes historical and legendary concerns as internal, moralized crises. The culmination of these internal strains is the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur confronts Mordred. Textual sources differ on specifics, but the symbolic significance remains consistent. The destruction of Camelot is primarily a result of internal division. The narrative stresses that no structural ideal, neither the Round Table nor centralized kingship, can fully prevent disintegration when human motives conflict with ethical expectations. Collapse is systemic, emergent from contradiction rather than external conquest. The narrative treatment of Lancelot and Guinevere further reinforces this theme. Their actions destabilize social cohesion, introducing conflict between personal loyalty, ethical duty, and institutional order. In literary terms, the affair demonstrates how private behavior can have political consequences, making the intimate a mechanism for systemic failure. These episodes establish a precedent for subsequent literature, which frequently frames the dissolution of kingdoms in terms of internal moral and ethical compromise. Scholarly interpretations emphasize that this focus on internal conflict reflects medieval concerns about governance, loyalty, and moral responsibility. Authors use narrative to model the consequences of ethical and political failure within hierarchical structures. Camelot becomes a laboratory for exploring the interaction of personal agency, institutional norms, and systemic resilience. The story of treachery functions as both moral allegory and narrative resolution. The deaths of principal figures, including Mordred, Lancelot, and ultimately Arthur, serve as closure to these intersecting crises. Texts depict Arthur mortally wounded, Mordred slain, and Lancelot exiled or penitent. These outcomes reinforce the causal logic established earlier. Collapse is the product of internal contradictions and ethical lapses rather than external military pressure. The narrative resolves the tension between idealized governance and human fallibility through dramatic but logically consistent events. The literary strategy of internal collapse also facilitates thematic continuity with preceding Arthurian motifs. The Round Table, chivalric quests, and moral tests remain central, yet they are reframed as conditions whose integrity depends on ethical compliance. Treachery demonstrates the consequences of deviation from these ideals. The narrative thus integrates courtly, ethical, and political structures into a unified analytical framework, where failure is both moral and systemic. In conclusion, the internal collapse of Camelot exemplifies a broader shift in Arthurian literature from martial conquest to moral and ethical narrative. Mordred's rebellion, Lancelot's affair, and the resulting fragmentation demonstrate that symbolic ideals cannot override human fallibility. Collapse is systemic, emergent, and morally coherent, emphasizing that governance, ethics, and institutional design are interdependent yet vulnerable to personal and collective lapses. Arthur's end would define his meaning. Mortally wounded, he transitions from temporal monarch to enduring symbol. The narrative frames the dissolution of Camelot not as defeat by external enemies, but as the consequence of contradictions inherent in human ambition, ethical lapses, and structural dependence. The story's closure allows subsequent Arthurian literature to explore the tension between ideal and reality, moral aspiration and human imperfection, laying the foundation for the continuing evolution of the legend. Arthur did not die. he departed. The Battle of Camlan occupies a central position in Arthurian narrative as the climactic confrontation that concludes Arthur's temporal reign. Accounts vary widely across textual traditions, including the Annals Cambri, the Vulgate cycle, and Middle English romances. Common to these sources is the portrayal of Arthur as mortally wounded, while the battle itself is often depicted as a result of both treachery and cumulative internal strain within Camelot. Unlike external military defeat, Camlan represents the culmination of ethical, political, and personal contradictions, with the final collapse emerging from within the court and its ideals. Sources diverge on specifics. The Annals Cambri records the battle briefly, noting Arthur's victory over Mordred but also his own death, without elaborating on consequences or burial. The Vulgate cycle expands the narrative, detailing Mordred's rebellion, Arthur's engagement, and the mortal wounding inflicted by internal conflict. Middle English adaptations emphasize the drama and moral weight of the confrontation, framing Arthur as a heroic but human figure, simultaneously sovereign, warrior, and symbol of chivalric order. The ambiguity surrounding Arthur's death is structurally significant. Across sources, the narrative often notes that his body was not definitively interred, with some texts asserting transportation to Avalon, a paradisiacal otherworld. This ambiguity serves multiple narrative and symbolic purposes. It preserves Arthur's enduring authority in mythic memory, allows for interpretive flexibility in moral and spiritual readings, and provides continuity for subsequent storytelling. By departing rather than definitively dying, Arthur embodies the possibility of return, linking historical narrative with ongoing legendary resonance. Literary function of the ambiguous death is closely tied to the ethical framework established throughout Arthurian literature. The unresolved conclusion enables reflection on the consequences of internal collapse while preserving the moral exemplar of the king. Readers and audiences are presented with both the limitations of temporal authority and the enduring power of symbolic kingship. This duality reinforces the pedagogical and structural design of the legend. The narrative emphasizes causality. Camlan is portrayed not as a simple battle but as the consequence of cumulative internal failures, ethical lapses, personal betrayals, and structural weaknesses in Camelot's governance. Mordred's rebellion, Lancelot's affair, and factionalism among knights converge in a climactic event, demonstrating that narrative resolution depends on systemic logic. The battle's outcome is therefore both morally and narratively coherent, illustrating the interplay between personal action and structural consequence. Spatially, the depictions of Camlan are often abstracted. The battlefield is not historically localized with precision. It functions as a symbolic space in which ethical, political, and heroic trajectories intersect. This abstraction enables narrative focus on causality and consequence rather than military tactics, reinforcing the thematic priority of moral and structural collapse over historical specificity. Arthur's wounding is frequently described with attention to heroism and dignity. Authors emphasize courage in confrontation, loyalty in leadership, and adherence to ethical principles even amidst mortal peril. These depictions integrate narrative closure with moral instruction, illustrating the idealized response of a king confronted with the limitations of authority and the inevitability of consequence when human imperfection intersects with institutional fragility. The transportation of Arthur to Avalon, whether literal or allegorical, further reinforces his mythic status. Avalon functions as both spatial and symbolic construct, a paradisiacal otherworld preserving the king's life and authority beyond temporal constraints. This narrative device reconciles the tension between ethical collapse and enduring exemplar, maintaining Arthur's role as a moral, cultural, and heroic touchstone even in absence. It allows the legend to bridge temporal history and perpetual myth. Textual analysis highlights variation in narrative emphasis. Some accounts present Arthur as triumphant at Camlan, with moral and martial authority intact but bodily incapacitated. Others stress defeat, wounding, and failure of governance. Across traditions, however, the departure motif remains central. The absence of a definitive death allows continued relevance in subsequent narratives, preserves symbolic authority, and reinforces mythic flexibility. This continuity is key to the endurance of Arthurian legend. The ambiguity surrounding death also intersects with audience reception. Medieval readers and listeners engaged with multiple narrative layers simultaneously. Historical memory, ethical instruction, heroic exemplification, and spiritual allegory. Arthur's departure permits reinterpretation according to didactic, ethical, or narrative need, allowing for sustained cultural resonance across geographic and temporal contexts. The story accommodates local adaptations, political uses, and literary elaboration, underscoring the functional adaptability of myth. The Battle of Camlann and its aftermath also illustrate the limitations of idealized governance. Despite the Round Table and prescriptive ethical structures, the court proves vulnerable to ambition, desire, and betrayal. Narrative emphasis on internal causality contrasts with early martial-centered histories, situating failure within human and ethical dynamics rather than external conquest. In this sense, the collapse at Camlann completes the thematic trajectory established from the Round Table through internal strife, reinforcing systemic narrative logic. Symbolically, Arthur's ambiguous death serves as a mechanism for closure without finality. The narrative resolves temporal authority while preserving mythic and ethical relevance. This dual closure allows later authors, poets, and chroniclers to continue engaging with Arthur as a cultural, moral, and heroic exemplar. Subsequent adaptations, including Welsh, French, and English prose romances, exploit this narrative strategy to explore renewal, legacy, and the tension between temporal failure and enduring virtue. The narrative also situates mortality within a moral universe. Arthur's departure to Avalon, the slaying of Mordred, and the outcomes for surviving knights collectively illustrate the consequences of ambition, ethical failure, and structural collapse. While mortality is unavoidable, symbolic authority persists, demonstrating the interplay between human limitation and enduring exemplarity. This balance underscores the didactic and mythic function of the Camlann episode. A king who sleeps is never defeated. The concept of Avalon as Arthur's final destination transforms the historical and legendary narrative into a framework of enduring hope and cultural continuity. Textual sources including the Vulgate cycle, post-Vulgate cycle, and Middle English adaptations depict Avalon as a paradisiacal, liminal space removed from mortal geography, where Arthur recovers from his wounds. This otherworldly island serves as a locus for political mythmaking, consolidating his authority beyond the temporal limits of Camelot and allowing audiences to perceive his reign as unfinished rather than conclusively ended. Avalon functions as a narrative mechanism for the concept of messianic return. By placing Arthur in a state of suspension rather than absolute death, authors create the potential for reemergence at moments of national or moral crisis. This motif mirrors similar eschatological frameworks in European literature, where heroic or divine figures are preserved in stasis, returning when societal need demands. Within Arthurian tradition, the promise of return reinforces the symbolic power of kingship, embedding Arthur's authority in both cultural memory and ethical exemplar. The association of Avalon with healing and preservation underscores the didactic dimension of the legend. Arthur is not merely removed from the world. He is sustained in a state of potential, reflecting values of endurance, resilience, and moral continuity. Chroniclers emphasize that his wounds are not fatal but recuperable, creating a narrative in which the ethical and symbolic authority of kingship outlasts physical vulnerability. Avalon thus becomes a literary device to reconcile mortality with enduring exemplarity. Political and social contexts likely influenced the development of the messianic return motif. In regions experiencing instability, dynastic fragmentation, or external threat, the legend provided a conceptual framework through which hope and legitimacy could be projected onto historical memory. Arthur's anticipated return functioned symbolically as a guarantor of justice and moral rectitude, even in the absence of effective temporal authority. This allowed audiences to maintain cultural cohesion through shared narrative expectation. The narrative framing of Avalon also preserves continuity with Celtic traditions of the otherworld. Earlier Welsh and Breton material situates sacred islands as locations of healing, immortality, or transition between mortal and supernatural realms. Christian authors adapted these motifs, integrating them with theological and moral imperatives. In this synthesis, Avalon simultaneously serves as a culturally familiar locus, and a morally structured space in which the king's authority and virtue remain intact, yet suspended, awaiting the proper temporal context for reemergence. Literary representations of Arthur's stay in Avalon emphasize its liminality. He is removed from immediate political action, yet his presence continues to exert influence over the world through narrative and memory. Texts describe attendants, magical healing, and angelic or priestly figures facilitating his preservation. These descriptions create a narrative architecture in which temporal absence does not equate to narrative or symbolic erasure, enabling Arthur to function as both historical memory and mythic exemplar. The motif of return is consistently invoked in later adaptations. Chroniclers and romance writers suggest that Arthur will emerge during a period of national crisis, restoring justice and order. This messianic framing aligns Arthurian legend with broader medieval European narrative paradigms, where heroic figures act as both historical exemplars and guarantors of moral or political order. The predictive or conditional return reinforces the legend's didactic and structural utility within cultural memory. Avalon also mediates the tension between historical plausibility and mythic function. While Camlin provides a narrative endpoint for temporal authority, Avalon introduces narrative elasticity, allowing the legend to transcend immediate historical or political constraints. Authors exploit this liminality to sustain ethical, political, and heroic paradigms, enabling Arthur to remain a functional moral and symbolic reference point long after the collapse of his court. The literary function of Avalon extends beyond ethical or political symbolism. By situating Arthur in a space outside temporal constraint, authors create a narrative continuity that permits retelling, adaptation, and reinterpretation. His deferred return allows subsequent writers to integrate Arthur into emerging cultural, political, and religious frameworks, linking local memory, national identity, and literary invention. This narrative elasticity contributes to the enduring relevance of Arthurian legend across centuries and regions. The anticipation of return also serves a psychological and social function. In contexts of political upheaval, war, or dynastic uncertainty, Arthur represents stability, justice, and legitimacy. Belief in his eventual reappearance provides symbolic reassurance, projecting a solution to disorder onto a figure whose authority and virtue are uncontested. While historical reality offers no evidence for such an expectation, the narrative demonstrates the functional power of myth in sustaining social cohesion and ethical reflection. Avalon, therefore, is both spatial and conceptual. It situates Arthur beyond the limits of mortality while maintaining his narrative and ethical presence. Textual descriptions emphasize the otherworldly, sacred nature of the locale, often using imagery of islands, rivers, and gardens to signify separation from mortal time. By doing so, authors codify a literary and moral geography that balances the end of temporal rule with the continuity of symbolic authority. The narrative maintains tension between absence and expectation. Arthur's physical withdrawal contrasts with his ongoing narrative influence. Knights, tales, and collective memory sustain his authority even in dormancy. This dual presence reinforces the functional utility of the legend, ensuring that the king's authority and moral exemplarity are simultaneously concluded and perpetuated. Avalon, therefore, enables both closure and continuity within the Arthurian corpus. Symbolically, Avalon links the historical and moral dimensions of Arthurian legend. Camlin concludes the king's temporal reign, illustrating the consequences of internal conflict and ethical failure. Avalon, by contrast, preserves his potential, transforming the narrative from finality into a promise. This structure allows the legend to operate as a dynamic cultural tool, integrating moral instruction, political legitimacy, and heroic memory within a single narrative framework. Finally, Avalon's role in the legend demonstrates the enduring adaptability of Arthurian myth. By situating the king in a state of suspended action, the narrative accommodates reinterpretation, local adaptation, and symbolic projection. The legend survives beyond the historical, political, and social conditions of its origin, maintained by literary strategies that emphasize potentiality, ethical exemplarity, and cultural continuity. This is the Arthur most readers recognize. By the late 15th century, Arthurian tradition had accumulated centuries of literary and oral material across Britain and continental Europe. Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, compiled in 1485, represents a pivotal consolidation of these narratives into a coherent corpus for English audiences. Malory drew from French prose romances, the Vulgate cycle, and earlier English adaptations, selecting, reordering, and sometimes abridging episodes to produce a unified sequence. In doing so, he transformed a variable and regionally diverse legend into a canonical narrative that would define subsequent English literary reception. Malory's synthesis reflects both literary and socio-political imperatives. England, emerging from the dynastic turbulence of the Wars of the Roses, was receptive to narratives emphasizing order, justice, and ethical conduct. Malory's Arthur embodies the chivalric king, whose court, knights, and moral code provide a model of hierarchical and ethical coherence. The work emphasizes continuity between episodes of martial prowess, courtly conduct, romantic endeavor, and moral testing, presenting a fully integrated narrative suitable for a literate and aristocratic audience. The structure of Le Morte d'Arthur demonstrates careful narrative organization. Malory divides the work into books that correspond to the rise, consolidation, and fall of Camelot, integrating themes of loyalty, betrayal, spiritual quest, and heroic exemplarity. By codifying episodes such as Lancelot and Guinevere, the Grail quest, and Camlin within a continuous chronology, Malory effectively fixes character arcs, thematic patterns, and ethical imperatives in a manner previously unavailable in fragmented oral or manuscript traditions. Language and style further contribute to Malory's canonization. Written in Middle English, the text is accessible to literate audiences, while retaining formal registers that convey authority, moral gravity, and courtly decorum. Malory's editorial choices, omitting regional variations, harmonizing inconsistencies, and framing events in a linear temporal sequence, standardize the legend and emphasize narrative coherence. In doing so, he transforms a collection of episodic tales into a recognized national literary work. The work's immediate reception reflects the stabilizing function of canonization. Manuscripts circulated among aristocratic readers, and subsequent printed editions, most notably William Caxton's 1485 edition, amplified accessibility. The printing press allowed Le Morte d'Arthur to reach wider audiences, effectively securing the narrative in English literary culture. This technological intervention ensured the endurance of Malory's version as the definitive framework for Arthurian storytelling. Malory also systematizes ethical and chivalric codes within his narrative. Knights' actions are measured against both moral and social standards, with loyalty to Arthur, adherence to justice, and spiritual integrity serving as evaluative criteria. Episodes of failure, such as Lancelot and Guinevere's affair or internal dissension at Camelot, are integrated into a moral logic that reinforces the consequences of deviation. By embedding ethical frameworks within narrative continuity, Malory provides both entertainment and instruction. The canonization process also stabilizes mythic and symbolic elements. Avalon, the Grail, the Round Table, and the messianic dimensions of Arthur's authority are consistently incorporated, with emphasis on narrative resolution and ethical interpretation. Malory's arrangement ensures that these motifs are interrelated, reinforcing thematic cohesion and supporting interpretive clarity for subsequent readers and writers. As a result, elements that were once disparate or regionally variable gain centralized cultural and literary significance. Finally, Malory's work establishes a baseline for later adaptations, translations, and artistic interpretations. By fixing characters, plotlines, and moral frameworks, Le Morte d'Arthur provides a canonical reference point for Renaissance literature, early modern drama, and subsequent nationalistic appropriations of Arthurian material. The combination of narrative coherence, ethical structuring, and textual dissemination ensures that Malory's Arthurian corpus defines the legend for centuries, shaping the reception of Arthur across England and beyond. Printing made legend permanent. Through Malory's synthesis and subsequent dissemination, Arthurian legend became a fixed literary and cultural reference, securing a continuous narrative tradition that persisted into modernity. The work provides both a historical consolidation and a mythic foundation, ensuring that the Arthur familiar to later audiences would be the product of systematic compilation, ethical codification, and literary canonization. Legend became propaganda. The Arthurian narrative acquired a new function under the early Tudor monarchy. Henry VII, seeking to consolidate power after the Wars of the Roses, deliberately invoked the imagery and symbolism of Arthur to legitimize his reign. The king's claim to the throne, derived in part through marriage to Elizabeth of York, required historical and cultural validation. By linking his dynasty to Arthurian myth, Henry VII constructed a narrative of continuity, moral authority, and national unity, projecting legitimacy through association with the legendary king. The most explicit example is the naming of his firstborn son as Arthur in 1486. This act was politically calculated. The name resonated with national memory of a just, heroic, and unifying ruler. It signaled the king's intent to restore stability, moral authority, and dynastic continuity. Contemporary chronicles and heraldic displays further reinforced the connection, drawing visual and textual parallels between Henry's court and Camelot, framing the Tudor regime as a renewal of ideal kingship. Courtly literature and commissioned works also reflected this political appropriation. Chronicles, masks, and genealogical illustrations depicted Arthurian motifs, situating the Tudor dynasty within a mythic narrative of virtuous rule. The legend's moral and ethical framework was thus leveraged as a model for contemporary governance, transforming cultural memory into a tool for political messaging. By invoking Arthur, the Tudors aligned themselves with ideals of chivalry, justice, and national cohesion. This strategic use of myth demonstrates the adaptability of Arthurian legend. Originally a narrative of heroic and moral exemplarity, it became a medium for asserting political legitimacy and dynastic ideology. The legend's symbolic resonance allowed rulers to project authority beyond immediate historical precedent, creating a sense of historical inevitability and moral justification for their governance. In this way, myth, memory, and political practice intersected. Modernity would reinterpret the myth again. Tudor deployment of Arthurian imagery illustrates how legends are continually reframed to serve evolving social, political, and cultural purposes. By the 16th century, Arthur's story had shifted from historical speculation and literary canonization to a tool of statecraft, demonstrating the enduring utility and flexibility of myth in shaping both identity and authority. Evidence resists certainty. Archaeological investigation into Arthurian legend has long captured public imagination, yet it remains characterized by ambiguity and caution. Sites such as Cadbury Castle in Somerset and Tintagel in Cornwall have been proposed as historical anchors for Arthur, based on structural remains, artifact assemblages, and regional prominence in early medieval sources. Excavations at Cadbury Castle reveal fortifications dating to the 5th and 6th centuries CE, including defensive walls, domestic structures, and high-status material culture, while Tintagel demonstrates continuity from late Roman occupation into post-Roman activity. These findings establish elite settlement and fortification patterns consistent with narratives of regional leadership but provide no conclusive link to a historical Arthur. Claims of identification often rely on circumstantial evidence. Archaeologists and historians emphasize that dating, stratigraphy, and artifact assemblages can support interpretations of political importance without confirming individual identities. For example, Tintagel's substantial imported pottery, Mediterranean trade goods, and architectural complexity indicate elite occupation, potentially the seat of regional rulers in post-Roman Britain, yet nothing explicitly connects these occupants to the legendary king. The same caution applies to other sites proposed as Arthurian strongholds or battle locations. Scholarly consensus underscores the distinction between historical plausibility and narrative projection. Material culture can indicate centers of power, warfare, or social hierarchy in post-Roman Britain, offering context for the emergence of heroic traditions. However, linking these remains to Arthur is speculative. Textual sources like the Historia Brittonum and Annals Cambri provide minimal geographic specificity, while literary expansions from Geoffrey of Monmouth onward overlay mythic elements onto a fragmentary historical substrate. Archaeology, therefore, is valuable for reconstructing social and political structures but cannot verify legendary individuals. This perspective also informs methodological restraint. Rigorous interpretation focuses on settlement patterns, defensive structures, and socio-political organization, situating the legend within plausible historical frameworks. Researchers emphasize comparative chronology, regional interaction, and evidence of elite continuity to explore conditions conducive to the development of Arthurian memory. Such approaches allow for historical contextualization without conflating narrative tradition with empirical verification. The question of a historical Arthur may itself be misplaced. Archaeology provides insight into post-Roman Britain, its warlords, fortified settlements, and networks of power, but cannot definitively corroborate legendary figures. Instead, these investigations illuminate the milieu from which the Arthurian narrative could emerge, demonstrating how memory, myth, and political structure intersected in early medieval Britain. Evidence clarifies the context but resists certainty, emphasizing the enduring gap between historical reconstruction and narrative legend. Meaning outlasts evidence. Arthur's endurance is less a product of verifiable history than of narrative adaptability. Over centuries, successive authors, chroniclers, and audiences reshaped his story to reflect evolving social, political, and moral priorities. From post-Roman war leader to chivalric king, from literary construct to national symbol, the legend demonstrates remarkable elasticity. This flexibility allows Arthur to function across contexts even in the absence of archaeological or textual proof of a historical individual. Literary structures, particularly those established by Geoffrey of Monmouth and Mallory, codified a framework capable of continuous reinterpretation. Episodic narratives, moral exemplars, and symbolic motifs, Avalon, the Grail, the Round Table, provide scaffolding for adaptation. Authors could emphasize martial heroism, courtly ethics, spiritual questing, or dynastic legitimacy as suited their contemporary audience, ensuring relevance regardless of empirical verification. The legend's endurance arises from this capacity to integrate changing cultural, political, and ethical concerns. The socio-political functions of Arthurian myth further contribute to persistence. Medieval rulers, including the Tudors, leveraged Arthur to legitimize authority. Local communities appropriated the narrative to reinforce collective identity. Literary markets exploited popular fascination. Each deployment reinforced the symbolic power of Arthur, embedding the figure into cultural memory independently of historical fact. Narrative resonance, not empirical certainty, determines the legend's survival. Archaeology contextualizes but does not constrain the legend. Material evidence of post-Roman elite centers, fortified settlements, and interregional networks illuminates the historical substrate from which the Arthurian narrative could arise. Yet these findings do not restrict creative elaboration. Instead, the legend persists because its structure accommodates both historical plausibility and mythic expansion, allowing audiences to reconcile fragmentary history with enduring narrative significance. Finally, Arthur's persistence reflects a broader principle in cultural memory. Symbolic meaning often outweighs factual verification. Legends endure when they address ethical, political, or psychological needs, providing exemplars and frameworks for understanding social order, heroism, and leadership. Arthur exemplifies this phenomenon, demonstrating that the impact of a narrative is measured less by historical evidence than by the utility, adaptability, and interpretive richness it affords successive generations. Legacy matters more than origin. Arthur's continued presence in literature, art, and cultural imagination illustrates that historical certainty is not necessary for enduring significance. The legend thrives because it provides ethical paradigms, narrative cohesion, and symbolic authority, all of which persist even in the absence of proof. Each era remakes Arthur. The 19th century witnessed a deliberate revival of Arthurian legend, reframed to suit the moral, cultural, and national ideals of the Romantic period. Writers, poets, and artists emphasized Arthur as a paragon of virtue, heroic integrity, and spiritual exemplarity. Rather than historical reconstruction, Romantic engagement focused on ethical and aesthetic dimensions, presenting Arthur as a moral ideal whose narrative could inspire national imagination. This reframing reflects a broader European interest in medievalism, historical memory, and the symbolic use of heroic figures to articulate contemporary values. Literary figures such as Alfred, Lord Tennyson played a central role in this revival. Tennyson's Idylls of the King recast Arthurian episodes within a morally coherent, cohesive narrative emphasizing chivalry, personal responsibility, and national unity. The poet selectively adapted episodes from Malory and French sources, emphasizing character development, ethical dilemmas, and symbolic coherence. By linking Arthurian ideals to contemporary moral discourse, the legend became a tool for cultural education and reflection on national identity. The Romantic Revival also engaged with political and cultural nationalism. In Britain, Arthur became a symbol of unity, justice, and moral authority, resonating with post-industrial social concerns and the desire to construct a continuous national narrative. Paintings, historical novels, and public discourse positioned Arthur as a model of governance, ethical leadership, and heroic virtue. The legend was no longer merely entertainment. It served as a conceptual framework for evaluating contemporary society against the virtues of an idealized past. This period also reinterpreted the spatial and symbolic dimensions of Arthurian narrative. Camelot, Avalon, and other loci were imbued with moral and aesthetic significance, linking geography with ethical meaning. Romantic writers highlighted the contrast between moral perfection and human fallibility, emphasizing ethical lessons rather than historical specificity. In doing so, Arthur's legend became a flexible instrument for exploring cultural, social, and moral questions, adaptable to the values of each audience. Ultimately, the 19th century revival demonstrates the enduring malleability of Arthurian legend. Each era reconstructs the king in ways that reflect contemporary concerns, ethical priorities, and national discourse. Romantic reinterpretation reinforced Arthur as a moral exemplar and cultural touchstone, ensuring that the legend remained relevant and instructive. The work of this period illustrates that Arthur's significance derives not from historical verification, but from his capacity to embody enduring ethical and cultural ideals. The legend remains unfinished. Even in romantic reinvention, Arthur functions as a living symbol, whose narrative can be continually reinterpreted, reshaped, and applied to successive cultural, moral, and national contexts. The 19th century revival established patterns of adaptation that persist into modern literature, visual arts, and popular media. Legend survives by changing. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed Arthurian legend enter mass media, including literature, film, television, and digital formats. These reinterpretations frequently prioritize narrative appeal, ethical allegory, or entertainment value over historical fidelity or scholarly consensus. The legend's adaptability ensures that each generation produces a version suited to contemporary tastes and cultural priorities, emphasizing heroism, romance, or fantasy in ways that often depart from medieval sources. Literature provides a central vehicle for modern adaptation. Works ranging from T.H. White's The Once and Future King to contemporary fantasy novels reinterpret Arthur and his court through diverse ideological and ethical lenses. White's mid-20th century retelling foregrounds human psychology, moral complexity, and institutional critique, blending historical narrative with philosophical reflection. More recent fantasy works exploit Arthurian motifs for world-building and adventure narratives, further divorcing the legend from temporal or geographic specificity. Cinema and television amplify these transformations. Film adaptations, from John Boorman's Excalibur, 1981, to modern franchises, visualize Arthurian legend with emphasis on spectacle, narrative clarity, and thematic resonance. Directors select and reinterpret episodes, Camelot, The Grail Quest, The Fall of the Kingdom, to suit audience expectations, often merging or omitting medieval sources. Television series, graphic novels, and streaming adaptations extend this process, introducing serial narratives and interactive forms that emphasize engagement over historical accuracy. Popular culture also reinforces symbolic and ethical dimensions. Even in fantastical or fictionalized media, Arthurian motifs, loyalty, heroism, justice, betrayal, and redemption remain central. The Round Table, Avalon, and Excalibur function as recognizable symbols, facilitating audience identification and narrative continuity. These enduring elements underscore the legend's capacity to transmit ethical and cultural ideals, even when divorced from verifiable history. The persistence of Arthur in modern media demonstrates the dynamics of narrative longevity. Adaptability allows the legend to remain culturally salient, continuously reshaped to address new aesthetic, ethical, or social concerns. While scholarship provides critical context and historicization, popular adaptations operate independently, ensuring ongoing visibility and engagement. The legend's survival relies on its mutability, its ability to maintain meaning while accommodating dramatic, technological, and cultural innovation. This leads to final assessment. Modern reinterpretations highlight that Arthur's cultural authority derives not from historical verification but from narrative resilience. Across media, the legend continues to function as a tool for ethical exploration, cultural expression, and imaginative engagement. The enduring presence of Arthur in contemporary consciousness underscores the interplay between myth, memory, and adaptation, framing the figure as both a product of history and an ongoing cultural creation. Arthur is not evidence of the past, but evidence of how the past is remembered. The figure of Arthur exemplifies the intersection of historical circumstance and cultural imagination. Emerging from post-Roman Britain, a period marked by political fragmentation, regional warlords, and social instability, Arthur's narrative reflects the need for heroic exemplars in an unsettled society. Early textual references present him not as king, but as a warrior whose deeds consolidated collective memory and moral authority. These records, combined with archaeological and textual evidence of post-Roman elites and fortified settlements, demonstrate that the legend is grounded in social and political realities without verifying a singular historical individual. Medieval authors amplified these foundations to meet contemporary needs. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae and Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur transform a regional warrior figure into a chivalric monarch, creating a narrative that addressed political legitimacy, ethical instruction, and national cohesion. Arthur became a lens through which authors explored authority, morality, and societal order. His development illustrates the capacity of narrative to shape collective memory, encoding both ideals and cautionary lessons into cultural consciousness. The persistence of Arthurian motifs, Camelot, Avalon, the Grail, the Round Table, demonstrates that mythic elements often outlast historical verifiability. These motifs function symbolically, providing ethical paradigms, narrative cohesion, and cultural reference points that respond to audience needs across centuries. The legend's adaptability allowed integration into Tudor propaganda, romantic moral philosophy, and modern popular media, showing that Arthur's significance derives from interpretive utility rather than empirical existence. Scholars therefore emphasize interpretive analysis over literal historicity. Arthur serves as evidence of societal priorities, narrative construction, and memory formation. His endurance reflects the interplay between political exigency, literary imagination, and audience reception, revealing how communities encode authority, virtue, and identity through story. In this sense, Arthur is as much a historical artifact of memory as a subject of inquiry into Britain's early medieval period. Legacy replaces certainty. Arthur's importance is not contingent on factual verification but on his capacity to shape cultural consciousness, ethical reflection, and imaginative engagement. By studying Arthur, historians, literary scholars, and cultural theorists gain insight into how societies construct meaning from fragmentary histories, demonstrating that legends endure because they articulate collective memory, address moral and political needs, and remain adaptable across time. Some stories endure because they explain more than facts ever could. Arthurian legend provides a framework for understanding how societies create, transmit, and preserve cultural memory. While no contemporary evidence confirms the existence of a historical Arthur, the legend demonstrates the mechanisms through which communities encode values, political ideals, and heroic exemplars. From post-Roman Britain to Tudor propaganda, from romantic literature to modern media, the narrative adapts to meet ethical, political, and cultural needs, revealing patterns in myth-making and the social function of narrative. The endurance of Arthur illustrates the interaction between memory and authority. Early references depict a warrior figure whose exploits were remembered to reinforce social cohesion and collective identity in post-Roman Britain. Later medieval authors expanded these foundations, shaping Arthur into a monarch and moral exemplar. This evolution shows that myth does not emerge in a vacuum. It reflects the priorities, anxieties, and aspirations of the societies preserving it. Arthur's legend therefore offers a lens through which to study the construction of historical consciousness. Arthurian motifs, Camelot, Avalon, the Round Table, the Grail, serve as symbolic structures for exploring governance, justice, and ethical conduct. Their persistence across centuries demonstrates how narrative frameworks can transmit values independently of historical verification. Each reinterpretation, whether political, literary, or cinematic, reaffirms the capacity of story to function as a repository of collective ideals, allowing successive audiences to engage with ethical questions and societal norms in a mediated form. The legend's adaptability also underscores the distinction between historical fact and interpretive meaning. By surviving in multiple media, languages, and cultural contexts, Arthur illustrates how myth can maintain relevance despite, or because of, its lack of empirical evidence. Historical and literary scholarship interprets the legend not to locate a singular truth, but to analyze patterns of memory, identity, and cultural continuity. Arthur's significance resides in these processes rather than in chronological certainty. In conclusion, Arthur endures because he embodies the dynamics of memory, power, and cultural narrative. The figure functions as a lens for exploring how societies construct authority, codify values, and negotiate continuity across generations. His story demonstrates that legends provide insight into human priorities, societal organization, and ethical frameworks in ways that purely factual histories cannot. By studying Arthur, historians and audiences alike can observe the intersection of imagination and reality, revealing the profound role of narrative in shaping cultural understanding. Before you drift away into the night, consider subscribing to Nightfall History for daily explorations of the past. Click the bell icon to be notified whenever a new documentary goes live, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Arthurian legend intrigued you the most? Every view, subscription, and conversation helps keep history alive.